लगता है टैक्सेस मतलब बढ़ने के कारण से पेट्रोल वगैरह की चार्ज बढ़ने से दाम बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ेंगे, ऐसे ही लग रहा है।
कुछ तो बढ़ाएंगे, लेकिन उन चीज़ों में बढ़ाएंगे जो ज़्यादा ज़रूरी नहीं है, जो अमीर लोग खरीदते हैं।
नहीं लगता तो जैसे कि गवर्नमेंट हमें बता रही है तो इसमें टैक्सेस देने के डबल डोज देने का उनका इरादा है, तो वो उसकी हम वेटिंग कर रहे हैं क्या आएगा, क्या मिलेगा हमको।
कीमतें बढ़ेंगी और ये होगा ही, क्योंकि जिस तरह हमारे देश की परिस्थिति है और हम सबको मिलकर उसका सामना करना ही पड़ेगा।
Budget time this year is unusual for several reasons. First, of course, it comes in the wrong month, July instead of February, when several months of the financial year are already over. Second, it comes with a new government in office, so we can expect several new policies to be unveiled at the time of the budget, providing a new element of excitement, if you will. Third, it comes at a particularly critical moment for the economy because we face a fiscal crisis, a foreign exchange crisis, and high rates of inflation. All this has a bearing on the budget, and we are all hoping that the Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, will be able to pull several rabbits out of his hat, or turban, if you will. But before we come to what the budget may or may not have, let us first take a look at what kind of mess the economy is in, because this will have a critical bearing on the kind of budget we are going to get.
Unfortunately, on grounds of political expediency and not on grounds of any financial or administrative difficulties, the entire exercise of presenting the full-fledged budget was put off, and a 4 months vote on account was presented to the House. Now, what was the financial impact of this exercise? It was a vote on account for 4 months, so the taxation structure was frozen. So there were no additional revenues available for those 4 months. Allocations were available only for the ongoing projects. For the new projects and new services, no allocations were available. For various departments and ministries, no fresh allocations were available.
The economic situation is that fairly harsh measures are called for in order to get things under control. A number of important steps have already been taken by the government, and the budget is being framed against the backdrop of these measures. Very tight import curbs, a sharp credit squeeze, higher bank interest charges, and now a totally revamped trade policy. The import curbs are meant to help the balance of payments, the credit squeeze to control prices, and the trade measures to help balance trade, as well as cut the budget deficit by ending the export subsidy.
But the overall impact of all these measures, and more that may be coming in the near future, is that economic growth this year will slow down.
I am afraid this year we may not have a very substantial growth, because to my mind, all these measures will take some time to settle.
In fact, after years of fairly rapid growth and an annual average growth of over 5% during the 1980s, growth this year is expected to be as low as 4% or even less. That is assuming that we will have a normal monsoon, which is a matter of some uncertainty.
Slower growth may be well accompanied by higher inflation. Already last year saw consumer prices going up by over 13%, the biggest increase in more than a decade. And there are a number of reasons why prices may go up still further this year. For instance, the recent devaluation of the rupee's external value by about 20% means that both imported goods and goods with imported components will cost more. One estimate is that this alone will make prices go up by over 2%. Then the drive to reduce subsidies on articles like fertilizer and food grain will mean that their prices too may have to be raised.
Obviously, there will be some inflationary impact as a result of the readjustment of rupee value, particularly in respect of the imported items. Reduction of subsidies would also have some impact, but not to a great extent to my mind.
There is a certain area where a inflationary impact is unavoidable. For instance, if the government raises the issue prices of food grains, it raises administered prices, then it will have an inflationary impact. Devaluation, for instance, will definitely have an inflationary impact. The rate rise in interest rate will have an inflationary impact. The government has already taken some steps which will immediately have an inflationary impact on the economy. Freight and fares will go up, they will have an inflationary impact. Now therefore the government must take matching steps to contain the inflationary impact of some of these steps which they have taken and they are likely to take.
Interestingly enough, the Congress election manifesto had promised to roll back the prices of these 10 items to the levels existing in July last year. One estimate is that this election promise, if fulfilled, would cost the government a staggering 7,000 crore rupees. Clearly, that kind of money is not available. And the Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, initially indicated that rolling back prices in this manner may not be possible. Later, however, he said the manifesto would be used as a guide to action. This means that at least a part of the promise to roll back prices will be fulfilled through the budget.
That apart, the primary focus of the budget is going to be on cutting the fiscal deficit, which over the years has grown to gargantuan proportions. Take the figures for last year, when the central government spent a total of over 106,000 crore rupees. As much as 40% of that was financed by what is known as the fiscal deficit. The target this year is to bring down the fiscal deficit drastically and presents the Finance Minister with a difficult task.
The deficit has to be brought down. First of all, since you are going to IMF, IMF is insisting on it. But even otherwise, it was quite clear that the deficits of the order which you are having in the last few years are not sustainable, and therefore something had to be done about it.
The reference to the IMF is important because if India is to get a badly needed loan of $2 billion from the International Monetary Fund, the Finance Minister will first have to reduce the deficit and then announce a new set of policy measures that will convince the IMF that India is serious about economic reform so that it is in a position to repay the IMF loan.
The budget is just more than arithmetic. I mean, although we have just been talking about expenditure, revenue, deficits, I mean, that's one part of it. And that's a very important task, is to reduce the fiscal deficit. The second part is also the budget gives directions to the economy. And the Finance Minister as well as the Prime Minister, both of them have said that they would like to give a new direction to the economy.
New directions would mean what?
New directions, for example, I mean, some directions have already been taken on the export and import side. Now, I assume that in relation to the government's role in the economy, in relation to public investment, in relation to licensing, in relation to all the other control and paraphernalia, I mean, there would be some policy announcements, I presume.
This is a budget which is the first step in the direction of a reform program. It will not try to do all, but it will set the guidelines as to which direction the country is moving, and this would be the real test of that in that sense.
But however radical the budget may be, the fact is that this is going to be a tough budget, simply because the government has no soft options left.
It is bound to be tough if it has to, say, reduce the gross fiscal deficit by as much as 2% of the GDP. It cannot but be tough, because you can do that only by cutting down expenditures and or by raising revenues.
Because of the inflationary pressures and the need to cut spending power as well as the deficit, this is going to be a budget that will cut back on expenditure rather than thrust forward.
To my mind, some amount of contractionist budget would be needed to tackle this situation.
Well, the overall macroeconomic environment is very difficult. Obviously, there has to be some fiscal contraction. There has to be cut in expenditure. There has to be some cuts somewhere in some kind of subsidies, I don't know what. There has to be a major drive to raising revenues.
A contractionist budget really means that the focus will have to be on cutting expenditure even more than on raising tax revenue. And this is not an easy thing.
Although the greatest excitement is about the revenue proposals after the budget is presented, I think a lot of time in the budget making is spent on the expenditure side. I mean, the ministry's expenditure, the plan side. And that is surprisingly enough also the most difficult part, because the demands on the government's expenditure are much larger than what government can afford.
If the focus of the budget is going to be on cutting expenditure, one major area of attack is going to be government subsidies. In other words, the prices of goods and services which the government now subsidizes for the consumer.
The total subsidy bill has grown so large that it now accounts for over 10,600 crore rupees of the government money every year, mostly on three items: food, fertilizer and exports.
The details of how rapidly the fertilizer subsidy has grown over the last decade, multiplying more than tenfold, shows the seriousness of the problem. And many feel that this can be tackled by raising fertilizer prices without affecting either food grain prices or the common man.
I feel that it is feasible to cut them. Fertilizer prices have not been changed for the last 10 years. The fertilizer consumption since 1980-81 has gone up by 100%.
If they cut back on fertilizer subsidy, then the increased input cost will have to be, the farmer will have to be compensated, and that compensation can come only through increase in procurement prices or support prices. And if you increase the procurement prices, then you will have to increase the issue prices, which means the food grains will become available to the consumer at a slightly higher rate, and that will have some impact on prices.
For a fairly complex set of reasons, even spokesmen for the fertilizer industry argue for a rise in fertilizer prices.
Now, to the extent you are able to control the cost of production and not increase, and also increase the consumer price, reduction in subsidy is justified. Our rough study shows, and which has been confirmed even by the Commission of Agriculture Costs and Prices, there we have found that a 10% increase in the fertilizer price has an impact, if I take the average yield and not the best yield, on the usage of fertilizer, hardly about 3 paisa per kg of wheat and rice.
Fertilizers, of course, are only one item of subsidy. There are several others where either the central or the state government makes up for what the consumer does not pay by providing a subsidy. Most of us don't realize that the water and power charges that we pay are subsidized charges, and the bus fares too.
Large number of these things are provided at below cost. Now, if they are provided at below cost, somebody has to finance the difference between the cost and the price at which they are sold, and that's the government. So if you look at all areas, I mean, including cloth here, including cloth, including water, electricity, a large number of areas where the government is operating. You mentioned DTC buses, DTC buses or education passes and so on. Many of these are justified, but only to a certain extent. I mean, the burden of these things is now becoming too great to bear.
Our electricity rates, for instance, water rates and transport rates are very low. These are some of the examples. They can be raised. It's true that raising administered prices like this and even indirect taxes, as I mentioned, may lead to some rise in the general price level. But that would be preferable to deficit financing, because deficit financing would hit the common man.
Now, what is happening at the moment is that food subsidy through the public distribution system is available to everyone. I have a ration card, you have a ration card, everybody can go. We need not be subsidized. That's a simple point. So therefore, there is a need to do away with a large number of ration cards which are being availed of by classes, by people who do not need to be subsidized, and make it available only to those sections which are in need of that subsidy.
What all this amounts to is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. If you don't pay the full cost of a product or service, it shows up in a subsidy, a higher budget deficit and inflation. But reducing the budget deficit means jacking up prices. So far, the government has done away with one item of subsidy, the export subsidy, through its new trade policy. This has saved the government rupees 2,000 crores and more in a year, but the result also is higher import costs.
Some subsidies have been cut, which means there is a saving there. We expect an import compression. There will be a saving there. We expect a massive boost in exports. There will be a gain there.
But cutting expenditure is not easy and could have negative effects too.
Let me give you my nightmare thing. For example, during last 2-3 years, the government has been cutting the budgets of the universities in this place, 15% cut and all that. What did we do? We couldn't really, all of us together, say that we'll take less income, we'll get rid of useless help. We couldn't do any of these things. Instead, we stopped buying books. Now we have come to a stage in which we can't even buy journals. What is the implication? The future researchers will not be able to do quality research. That's the kind of thing, the soft option the government, I'm afraid, will take. In that context, it means, without hurting the interest group, you stop your maintenance expenditure on power stations, on railways, on roads, on communication system, all the infrastructural thing.
Unfortunately, while expenditure is sometimes cut in the wrong places, there are innumerable cases of wasteful public expenditure. Delays in public sector projects lead to cost increases of over 25,000 crores, and sometimes there are horror stories like this one.
This is a tale about a computerization project that began in 1973 and 12 years later was still not achieving much.
There are also cases like this building in New Delhi, which was built for the Asian Games of 1982. The original cost was 5 crores and it was meant to be a sports hostel. Later, it was meant to be a hotel and then yet again a hospital. Today, 9 years later, the building has still not been occupied for a single day and the cost has gone up to 100 crores. If the government is looking for real savings in expenditure, however, it will have to focus on the big ticket items, which are 3 if you leave out spending on the 5-year plans. These are subsidies, defense and interest payments on past loans.
We all know that interest, defense and subsidies are the 3 major items which account for a very large proportion of government's non-plan expenditure, about 75%. Now interest payments is something which I think very little can be done in the short run. Maybe in the long run, if the government reduces its borrowing and public debt goes down and interest rates also are brought down, there can be some respite on that. But in the short run, I do not think it is possible to do anything there. On the defense expenditure side, there is a general feeling that there is room for economy.
What does all this mean for the common man? The fear is that the burden of higher food and fertilizer prices, of higher water and electricity charges, and of higher train fares will be borne by the relatively poor people, while the more affluent middle class get away lightly. Quite obviously, this is a concern of the government.
When the present government talks about tightening the belts, I ask them a simple question: do tighten the belts. Because whose belts you are tightening? Those who haven't got even the vest to be tightened, what's the use telling them you tighten your belt? Therefore, there are a number of affluent sections and classes which go completely scot-free as far as tightening of the belts are concerned.
No budget is of course complete without some additional taxation. And what should the finance minister do this year? Many economists believe that Dr. Manmohan Singh should focus more on direct taxes like the income tax. But they say that he should try and get more people into the tax net rather than raise the tax rates. This is because the newly affluent sections, like traders and self-employed professionals, often get away without paying any tax at all.
Our tax base is very narrow in a country of 800 million people, 80 crores of people. I think the total number of taxpayers are less than 1 crore.
Today, we are collecting far less income tax than what this nation was paying, say, 15 years back. All of us were paying more income tax than what you are paying today.
I do not think altering the tax rates is going to do a great deal about collection of revenue. Everybody in this country knows your tax collection machinery has become incredibly inefficient and corrupt.
In indirect taxes, while excise duties can be expected to go up, there is pressure on the finance minister to reduce customs tariffs. This is a fallout of the devaluation of the rupee, as a result of which, for every dollar worth of imports, the rupee value goes up. Since the customs tariffs are on the rupee value, this means a windfall for the government. And people argue that this should be neutralized with lower customs tariff rates.
And I have appealed to the finance minister that there should be a general reduction in tariffs. If that takes place, that would also have an impact on the budget. I believe, and I think it's widely acknowledged, that high tariffs have an anti-export bias. Therefore, in the long run, tariffs must be reduced. And the time to make a beginning, I think, is now.
The fact also is that India's customs tariffs are very high, perhaps the highest in the world, and need to be reduced anyway.
The average unweighted tariff today is about 118%. That's very, very high. If you believe in Indian trade integrating with world trade, that's very high level. I can't foresee it going down to like 20%. It has immediate impact on revenue. But over 3 years to 5 years, maybe 3 years, if we can bring it down to an average of about 40%, that would be good.
One major problem is that the government has simply got too big. It spends enormous amounts of money, it has far too many people on its rolls, and many of them do precious little that is of use to anybody else.
As this chart shows, the central government alone spent as much as 107,000 crore rupees last year. To this must be added the 89,000 crore rupees spent by the various state governments. Together they spent nearly 200,000 crores. That works out to over 37 lakh rupees every minute. More important, this spending accounts for as much as 40% of the total national economic activity. If you add this to the public sector activity, one realizes how big the government in India really is. So isn't there scope for simply reducing the size of the government?
For instance, the new trade policy announced a couple of weeks ago did away with 7,000 licenses that the Commerce Ministry, which is housed in this building, used to issue to exporters and importers. That should render large numbers of government employees surplus. When other deregulation measures are also taken, even more employees may end up surplus. But retrenching government staff, it seems, is far too touchy a subject even today.
Reduction on staff is an extremely difficult proposition, and it has to be carefully evaluated before any decision is taken.
For some time, there should not be any further increase in the benefits which are accruing to the government employees. In the last few years, we have had a very good increase in benefits, and also there should be a moratorium on further employment in the government sector for some time.
If getting rid of surplus government staff is not possible just now, what about introducing some austerity in government spending?
You can, look up the telephone directory and run through all the list of organizations run by the government. There are a few, at least, you would find that one doesn't know what they are doing and why they are there.
The kind of austerity which one associated with government generally has become a thing of the past. And therefore, in every item, probably there is more expenditure being incurred than need be the case. So if we are really talking of tightening the belts, the government has to tighten its own belt first. And that is true of the public sector also.
The problem with belt tightening is not just with the centre. It is also with the state governments, which in the last couple of years have moved from surplus budgets to deficit budgets.
Thirdly, the problem is with public sector units. And the question here is whether the government will go through with the sale of public sector shares as was proposed in Mr. Yashwant Sinha's interim budget last March. These shares were to be sold to fetch 2,500 crores for the government. The basic problem is that there is very large investment in these public sector concerns but very poor returns on these investments.
The rate of return on public enterprises is only 1%. The central government at the moment has made an investment of about 1,60,000 crores on the various public sector projects. Now, if this investment generates at least 5% rate of return, which is a bare minimum they should have, then perhaps a lot of our budget problem would be over.
But any serious privatization move is likely to be opposed by public sector workers and their representatives, as we found out when talking to people at Scooters India in Lucknow.
प्राइवेटाइजेशन आप इसका प्राइवेट को देने की बजाय इसको जॉइंट सेक्टर में दे दीजिए, गवर्नमेंट का भी शेयर हो और पब्लिक का भी शेयर हो। उस शेयर में मैक्सिमम अगर शेयर टाटा का है या बजाज का है तो उसकी मैनेजमेंट यहाँ रखिए, वो मैनेजमेंट इसको चलाए।
प्राइवेट को हम बुरा नहीं मान रहे हैं कि प्राइवेट बुरा है, लेकिन प्राइवेट में जावा सिक्योरिटी बिल्कुल नहीं होती है।
That once again shows how difficult the task of reform is going to be. The economy has reached the point where the government has no soft options left. Prices have to be controlled, the foreign exchange situation has to be tackled, and the budget deficit has to be reduced. On top of all this, there has to be a new set of policy measures to deregulate the economy and prepare it for an export push. Few budgets, therefore, have been as important as this one, and in no previous year has so much depended on what the finance minister is going to announce.